I should thank Cheryl Duvall for inviting me to make this presentation tonight. I also want to acknowledge former members of the Lightship NPS staff who are with us this evening: Vicki Glenn, Chris Crusa, Brian McKissick, and Bob Hickman. I also want to give a shout out to my three best friends and sailing buddies and crew: Teresa Volman, Betty Grieve, and Carol Green. The Chesapeake Lightship was built in 1929. She was rescued and restored in 1971. My story with her begins in the late spring of 1973.
She was built as the first of the new LS-100 class of lightships. There would be 6 in all. They included quite modern features for the time, including DC electric generators, electric refrigeration instead of ice boxes, electric beacons instead of oil lamps. An AC generator was added by the Park Service in 1974. Propulsion was by means of an electric motor. 3 of the 4 DC generators were used to power the rotor in the motor. The 4th powered the stator. There are 2 Fresnel lenses mounted vertically atop the aft mast, each with its own light bulb. This was a redundancy feature. During tours, we would explain that the propeller was about the height of an average man and her rudder was the size of a barn door. Note that the cost of her construction is about what the annual budget was for her early years with the Park Service. As already mentioned, she was built in 1929 and commissioned the next year. After fitting out and sea trials, her first duty was Fenwick Island Shoal. In 1933, she was posted to the Chesapeake Bay entrance. When World War II broke out in full in 1942, lightships were moved to safety as they were considered a valuable asset. Chesapeake Lightship was moved to Sandwich, Massachusetts. At the end of the war, she was moved back to her station watching the Chesapeake Bay entrance. In 1962, there was a horrific hurricane with winds reported to be at least 125 miles an hour. The anchor roads both parted, heavy chains with links about 2 inches thick and 5,000-pound mushroom anchors. The pilot house was swept away by the seas and wind. She was towed into Norfolk for repairs and was back on station 1 week later. In 1966, she was posted to the Delaware Bay entrance, and this would be her last duty. She was retired and mothballed in the Cape May shipyard. The National Park Service acquired her in 1971. I will get into that story shortly. By 1972, she was ready for tours by the public. As a Coast Guard asset, she was manned by 5 officers, a cook, and 10 crew. The captain and XO were usually chief warrant officers. Duty was usually 2 weeks on and 1 week off. If ships had to be serviced by a shipyard, a relief vessel took their station temporarily. The captain had his own quarters with a private head immediately aft of the pilot house. All the other officers had their quarters off the wardroom in the stern. The 5 crew cabins were 1 deck below the bridge and slept 2 men each. The crew head was in the windlass room, forward, and the officer's head was at the base of the aft ladder along the port side. Given that the programs run by the National Park Service were much larger in scope, the staff and crew were necessarily bigger. The numbers detailed here are for the time just before my last duty with the program. To accommodate more crew members, the lower storage area on the deck below the cabin deck were modified to house 6 to 9 more bunks. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the location of the Chesapeake Light Station. It is approximately 18 nautical miles southeast of the Chesapeake Bay entrance. And this is a photo of the Chesapeake Bay Light Tower, light station, if you will, and the Chesapeake Lightship cruising by in the background.
Tom McFadden, a sailor, an artist, a writer, a dreamer, and a man who had a knack for getting things done. It was his dream and his energy that created the environmental programs hosted by the Chesapeake Lightship, which in kind was recreated through Tom's vision. I think of him now rather like a smarter, bolder version of Radar O'Reilly from MASH, knowing how to barter and deal more aggressively. He was also a bit of a used car salesman, which accrued to the benefit of the Lightship programs and all who worked aboard her. Tom believed that while classroom learning was important, being in and experiencing the environment was at least as important, if not more so, for developing young minds. In 1970, the National Park Service, National Capital Region, hired Tom to create programs for urban parks, ever imaginative in finding opportunities to engage young people. Tom acquired the decommissioned Coast Guard Lightship Chesapeake, which he converted to a floating marine laboratory and historical museum that offered programs in environmental education, history, ecology, and restoration for grade schoolers through university students. In a 4-year collaboration with district elementary school teachers, all DC 5th graders spent a day aboard the Lightship. With his having worked with BSA of the Capital Region, the male volunteer crew of the Chesapeake became members of Sea Explorer Post 1075. Several of the crew went on to careers with the U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, and some of us earned our captain's credentials through and because of our service aboard Chesapeake. Given that it was the early 1970s, girls were only allowed to be daytime volunteers but not full members of the crew. Mixed gender among teenagers in close quarters is probably still fertile grounds for shenanigans. Tom passed away in July of 2021 at the age of 93. Joe Murray, Commander U.S. Navy, retired, was true Boston Irishman with the brogue to go with that background. He was a retired Navy master diver. He was a demanding taskmaster and expected much from his crew. He usually got it. He loved to tell sea stories, particularly as teaching moments. These are other but not all members of the staff as I knew it. Mike Walk actually started as a volunteer. John Hart was radio and electronics officer. He had been the deck officer when I joined the crew. Chris Crusa took over as the deck officer, and I reported to him as the captain of the 45-foot harbor tug, Chickadee. Wally Shaw was the chief interpreter, i.e. tour guide. Larry Morrison was the chief engineer. Vicki Glenn was the program developer and Steve Miller science lead. I came to know about the Lightship when Vicki and Steve came to my high school McKinley in D.C. in the spring of 1973. The environmental programs were moderately interesting, but the thing that got my attention was that the crew of this large-ish ship were all boys my age. After the presentation, I approached Vicki and asked how I might join the crew. I don't recall now if I went to the ship in person or called, but I remember filling out a form, SF-71, and I reported for work in the middle of June after I got my work permit as I was only 15. I turned 16 2 weeks later.
There were 3 main programs on the Lightship. Ecological awareness programs were developed to help students and their teachers identify ecological challenges and potential solutions to those challenges. This often involved walking around in nearby swamps and wading hip-deep in local waters to sample and analyze environmental conditions. There was one time on a field trip when I was in hip waders and chest deep in the Potomac River. The Lightship was often spoken of as a living history. Even in the 1970s, she was a showcase of the construction and equipment advancements available in 1929. Her very role as a nav aid as compared to current technology is still amazing. Lastly, those of us who were her crew learned leadership skills. We necessarily developed our public speaking abilities, ta-da, by giving tours to the public and working with students and teachers on field trips and underways. Captain Murray made sure we were all proficient in maritime skills, especially the deck and bridge crew. As senior quartermaster, navigation and steering was my thing. Also, and this is a point which is as new as it is old, there was a matter of social awareness. The crew was a conglomeration of white boys from private schools or the isolation of Southern Maryland. Others of us were African American students from DC public schools. There were racial clashes, and I don't know if any minds were changed, but we did learn to work together as an effective crew. The lightship was retired as the Delaware Lightship to the Cape May shipyard. Here she is inboard of the 5 Fathoms lightship. This is where Tom McFadden found her. He was successful in convincing his management and the Department of Interior that acquiring the lightship as excess property would benefit the Park Service, the schools, and the citizens of the DC metropolitan region. A subsequent visit to the lightship in Cape May was disappointing in that the ship had been vandalized and cannibalized. Ship's wheel, anchor chain, lifeboats, all had been removed. Doors had been ripped off and portholes broken. Wiring had been ripped out. It was a gut-wrenching discovery, but Tom persevered and continued building his vision into reality. Some work was done in Cape May. Some was done as she was towed to the Washington Navy Yard. Would any of you here care to guess what the towing bill was for a 530-ton lightship from Cape May to Washington, D.C. by way of the C&D Canal? $4,500. Restoration work continued at the Navy Yard. Tom was told he could not do what he wanted. Very simply, he wanted a fully operational Chesapeake lightship. Both the Navy and the Coast Guard told him it was absolutely impossible. The photo of the Chesapeake at her berth on Haines Point that she reached under her own power. Not only did Tom prove the Navy and Coast Guard wrong, but he also convinced the Navy that it would be a great training exercise to build a floating dock infrastructure with water and shore power for the lightship. This is a photo of the cruddy, dirty annunciator that communicated speed and direction commands to the engine room from the bridge. This is as it was found in Cape May before the Park Service took command of her. You would also use sound-powered headphones to communicate verbally the commands at the same time. Again, redundancy. You can well imagine the dirt and muck that accumulated over the years in the bilge over 40 years. Mike Walk and Tom Lane here are cleaning the bilge. You can see all 4 diesel generators in a well-used and poorly maintained condition here in this photo. This is what the engines look like after a rebuild, cleaning, and fresh paint. Similarly, the annunciator has been cleaned and freshened too. This is the original 1929 electrical control panel for configuring the 4 generators and speed control. The knife switches are for switching generators in and out. The brass wheel at the lower left is the speed control, basically a big honking potentiometer for those of you who know what that is. The relays here would click and clack loudly as one changed speed and direction.
The original LS-116 designation is visible in the crossbeam over the engine room. This was my hangout. This is the pilot house. While it was work polishing the brass and no one liked that duty, we loved the gleam, and we were proud of it once we were done. You can see the compass binnacle in front of the wheel. Between the wheel and the binnacle is the rudder angle indicator. Until later in my tenure on the Chesapeake, the captain would give us rudder angle commands. To the right of the wheel is the pilot house annunciator. The chart table is to the right and behind. There was a LORAN, radar, and VHF radio in the pilot house. A voice tube ran from over the wheel to the flybridge above the pilot house. Similarly, there was one to the engine room, but your guess is as good as mine as to how well the engineers could hear through the voice tube. We would get fire training at least once a year at the DC Fire Academy down on 295 at the southeast end of DC. We would use CO2 extinguishers on small fires, but we also fought large JP4 jet fuel fires in big pits with 1.5-inch fire hoses and fog nozzles, sometimes one hose and sometimes with a two-team attack. Everyone had to participate, including the administrative staff.
Boat handling obviously was one of the maritime skills that we learned, and we had a pretty decent fleet associated with the Chesapeake, and with the exception of the 6 O'Day Widgeons, and I think we had 6 canoes as well, all these other vessels were acquired as excess property from various government departments. The range control boat at the upper right, that was acquired from Dahlgren Weapons Laboratory. On the lower left is a 40-foot motor launch that came from the Navy, as did the LCVP next to it. We got a 45-foot ketch from the Coast Guard Academy. And then in the lower right is a photo of the 45-foot tugboat Chickadee. And in my last year in high school, that was my first command. I was the captain of that tugboat. We primarily used that to take out small groups of people on it to do water sampling and that sort of thing. We also would take teachers out to get them trained up for the things that their classes would do when they would come aboard the lightship. We did ecological field trips as well. As I implied earlier, some were shore-based, but many were on actual underways on the lightship. In this picture, you can see Steve Miller and Vicky sitting on the gunwale. The gentleman in the red jumpsuit is Professor Mike Champ, the late Professor Mike Champ. I didn't know this until I was doing my research to put this program together, but he was involved in some studies related to dumping ocean waste, ocean sewage, and things of that sort. And he actually testified before Congress, and it was his research of the DuPont waste dumping and the sewage dumping from the city of Philadelphia that led to the banning of ocean dumping of any wastes and sewage. Now let's see if I can get to the next picture. So here you can see a group of high school students wading out into the Potomac. I think this is actually down where National Harbor is now. National Harbor would be off to the left in this photo, but we would drag these seine nets through the water to, catch various types of fish life and examine those to check their health and numbers and that sort of thing. Most of those people out there were high school students. There might have been a staff member out there with them as well. We also did underways, and this photo was taken not quite as far down as Mount Vernon, but south of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. You can see the gentleman here in the red parka, that's Cliff Sheets, and he's out on this platform overhanging the water. So in this picture, you can see there are 2 yellow tubes. One is up here, this kid's holding one, and here's another one down here. These were used to grab water samples from different depths simultaneously in the same location. The idea was you would lower them into the water, completely submerged, pull the trip line, they grab their samples, and then we'd pull them back aboard and do various microscopic and chemical analysis on the water. And yeah, no one's wearing PFDs in this picture. What can I say? It was the 70s and things were a lot more cavalier back in the day, but point noted. I actually took those pictures from the tugboat because we were alongside, as an escort vehicle that day. Part of the environmental studies would often be to catch fish and check on the health of them. Now, this garfish here was dissected, and they were looking at the roe, which they found inside of her, just to check on the health of the fish and how likely it would be to, populate. Ultimately, around, I don't know, 1980, 81, the Park Service had figured that they were pretty much done with funding the program. Um, Interestingly, the first year that the Lightship was in operation in the Park Service, the annual budget was about the same as the cost of construction in 1929. But anyway, in 1980, 81, Park Service decided to shelve the program, despite the fact that DC City Council and even Marion Barry, the mayor at the time, wrote several members of Congress trying to get the additional funding, but it never came through. So in June of 81, some of the old crew members, myself included, and some of the newer crew members took her on a 3-day journey to Baltimore from DC. The top 3 pictures were taken. So on the second night, we anchored off of Annapolis, and then the top 3 pictures were taken that morning on our way to Annapolis. It was so foggy that morning that even when we passed under the Bay Bridge, we could not see the bridge in any direction. All we could do was hear the foghorns on it. The tugboat there at the upper right, she was a Coast Guard vessel, and she came down to lead and escort us up the Craig Hill and Brewerton channels into Baltimore. The lower photos, I can't remember her name. She was one of the newer crew members who came along with us. One shot there, obviously, she's polishing brass, and the other shot is where we're coming into Baltimore Inner Harbor, and she's relaying engine commands to the engine room. In 1982, that was the year of Philadelphia's tricentennial. And again, some of us came back, and my wife is making funny signs here, so pardon my laughing. Again, the crews reconvened, and we brought her to Philadelphia by way of the C&D Canal. And we were one of the first ships in. We were anchored right there at Penn, or docked right there at Penn's Landing. I think you can see the Ben Franklin Bridge in the background in the upper left. So the next day was the parade of sail. And the best seats in the house, as far as we were concerned, were in the crow's nests of the Lightship. So on the forward nest is crew member Phil Melvin and Captain Bob Cooper at the time. Bob Spiegelthal and myself were in the aft crow's nest watching and taking photographs. So the middle photograph in the top is rather interesting. While we were up there, we could hear what sounded like music downriver, and we couldn't pinpoint where it came from. We could see the ships coming upriver, but until they got close, we couldn't get a really good look at them. So eventually, this ship showed up, and I forgot whether that was the Brazilian or the Colombian. My wife said she thinks it was the Brazilian tall ship coming into port, and all the crew were up in the rigging singing the Brazilian national anthem. It was really rather striking and moving to participate at that level. The top right photo, that's a look at the Coast Guard Eagle. She docked directly across the quay from us, and the gentleman walking down the gangway is none other than Walter Cronkite. While we were there, and the lower left photo, if you look in the background, you can see the Lightship Barnegat at dock there at the Philadelphia Museum. So 2 nights we were there, they had fireworks every night, and the barge from which they fired off those fireworks was docked right behind us. Couldn't have been more than 100 feet, 150 feet away from us. And given the weather both nights, we were right in the flight path of all of the shells. In the morning, we would find dozens of spent firework shells on the deck of the Lightship. They were basically cracked open spheres of multiple layers of heavily waxed brown paper. So I had said earlier that Captain Murray liked to tell sea stories and liked to teach through telling sea stories. Well, I have a couple that he might not like to have been repeated. There was one time we were coming back up the Potomac River and maneuvering to come through the old Woodrow Wilson Bridge, which was a drawbridge at that time. And the captain's habit was to give us rudder angle commands for steering. You know, right 2, right 4, right 8, ease your rudder. And the ship tended to need right rudder to steer a straight course. So as we're coming up to the bridge, the captain starts saying left 2, left 4, left 10, left 20, and the ship is turning to the left. Now, mind you, I'm looking at the rudder indicator. I'm not looking out the portholes because I'm trying to do what the captain's telling me to do. All of a sudden, I hear left full rudder, back full. And I look up, and people who had gotten out of their cars to take photographs of the ship and watch its passage through the bridge were now running off the bridge because the lightship was perpendicular to the opening of the bridge. So we got straightened out. We got through the bridge. You know, my stomach is all up in knots. And the captain bends down from the flybridge and says to me, "Why were you steering left when I said right?" I'm 15, 16 years old. And this is the captain talking to me. I didn't feel like I had the wherewithal to tell him, "No, you were wrong." Fortunately, Mr. Crusoe, who's here with us tonight, was on the bridge at that time, and he spoke up and said, "No, no, Captain, you were saying left, 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 left all the time." And so the moral of that story is, from that point forward, the captain never gave me rudder angle commands again. He would just basically say, steer on a given landmark, and that's what I would do. Coming back up the river from the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, I'd first steer on the Capitol Dome, for example, or sometimes I could see the dome of the Catholic Cathedral over in Northeast DC. I mean, the view was great coming up river. Many times I could even see my high school from the river coming up. So it felt good to have that kind of autonomy, to be at the wheel and be able to steer the ship all by my lonesome. And as I often told people, and still do, having this as my high school job beat the hell out of flipping hamburgers at McDonald's, even if the pay was not quite what I would have made flipping hamburgers at McDonald's. The other story is, by this time, I'm now captain on the tugboat. And once again, we are returning from a trip downriver. And I don't recall the tidal conditions, but the captain chose to yield the right of way to a vessel coming downriver. But due to the currents and other issues, once again, the lightship got cattywampus to the bridge opening. So we had to throw a couple of hawsers from the ship down to the tugboat, and we hauled her back away from the shallows and kind of straightened her out to get through the bridge. So fun times, exciting times at least, but yeah, sea stories. So as much fun as we had doing this work, there were some tragedies that happened through the program. I was not a member of the crew at this time in the ship's history when she first came down from Cape May, but I certainly heard enough about many of these. Most of these photos here depict flooding that went on at the Navy Yard when she was there. And there was one time when a heavy summer squall came blowing through the Navy Yard. One of the crew, without asking permission, without notifying anybody what he was doing, decided to take, I presume it was this rowboat, out for a cruise around the Navy Yard, being completely unmindful of the impending weather. Well, this squall blew through, and the last officer ashore that day saw the rowboat banging up on the dock, but just assumed it had come loose in the weather, tied it up, and went home. Eventually, Bo's family was missing him and called the ship to find out where he was, and turns out no one knew where he was. The police were involved, park police were involved. They actually conducted essentially a murder investigation, but about a month after the incident, Bo's body floated back to the surface. Apparently he had fallen overboard, drowned, and his body became tangled in all the submerged debris and detritus in the Washington Navy Yard. The case was closed, but it was a rather devastating event for Mr. McFadden. We did have some important events and some famous people on board. In the summers, and this was back when the presidential yacht Sequoia was still the presidential yacht. It was not uncommon on weekday evenings for us to see the yacht coming up the Washington Channel. And Richard Nixon was the president at the time, and he would signal to us that he wanted us to ring the bell on the bow, which we did, but only after, we had all run downstairs and gotten into our uniforms because the captain insisted. And, quite often we would see him on deck with Henry Kissinger. There was a weekend visit, a Saturday visit by Prince Knud of Denmark. And that was an interesting visit. You usually think of a prince as a somewhat young man, at least, as a 16-year-old kid, I did. But the gentleman that showed up was nigh on to 90, it looked like. And of course, we gave him a proper greeting as he worked his way up the gangplank to the main deck of the ship. Dave Goldsmith, the bosun, played Pipe the Side on his bosun's pipe. And of course, you have to hold the third
Do me a
note
favor.
until
Lanita's trying to call, and I don't know how to get her call.
you
Make
have to
sure
hold
all
the
your
third note until the visitor steps onto the deck. Well, 90 some years old, working his way up a 30-degree angled ramp took quite a while. I think Dave had to take about 3 or 4 gulps of air before he was able to finish piping the prince aboard. Then there was a weekend visit by a United Nations scientists for ecology and the environment. I believe we had an underway that day with them, but when we got back to our berth at Haynes Point, the crew unexpectedly was invited to join the scientists at Flagship or Hogate's, one of the two, for dinner that evening. So we went, and we were able to order. Now, again, remember, we're 15, 16, 17 years old. We were able to order wine and beer as the waiters and waitresses came around to the tables. No one asked for ID. I think they just assumed that since we were with this group, we were all of legal age. Eventually, one of the Lightship adult staff came around and told us to knock it off and nix on the drinking. So we were feeling quite good, but we behaved ourselves. One of the funnier moments was we were at a table with a Russian gentleman, and they had these plastic carafes of white wine on the table. Well, he poured wine into a bowl and dipped his fingers in it and then dried them with his napkin. I assume he thought it was water because the wine itself was so pale. After Tom had been reassigned to superintendent of the park at Catoctin Mountain Park, which surrounds Camp David, we would visit up there because it was a cool place to go. And it was not uncommon to hear the phone ring and hear him say, "Yes, Mr. President, I understand, Mr. President, I'll be right there." And he would turn around and say, at the time it was, Jimmy Carter was president, and he would say, "Well, the president wants to go fishing." So he would, head off and go fishing. After 1980, President Reagan was the one that would be calling down from Camp David. So some interesting times when hanging out with Tom and Vicky. So here's a photo of the crew from back in the day. Again, you can see the mix of people there. And again, you can see my tugboat there in the background. And if you couldn't find me, that's me right there. Big hair and all, but that was the 70s. So this photo was taken by one of the staff members. It was a favorite photo, and Tom would give this photo out to people as recognition for something well done, or to visitors who had come to the trip. So this is a very popular photo. I've got one here in my house, and I'm sure almost everybody else who worked on the ship has one as well. So, and you can easily read this yourself. My time on the Lightship was such a unique and valuable experience. I have run across so very few people who have had similar experiences, and I still firmly believe that my time on the Lightship, with the crew of the Lightship, with the adults who guided us and taught us at that time, it is a significant factor in the person that I am today, and it's particularly relevant to my love of sailing and to my absolute love for the Chesapeake Bay. Tom signed off on my sea service forms in 2009 while he and I were on a delivery trip from Annapolis to Florida. And it was my time on the Lightship that helped me get the sea time for my license. And finally, I owe a great deal of thanks to Vicky, because, we spent a morning at her house in Maryland, recounting stories, going through documents, pulling out some of the photos for this presentation. So I absolutely thank her for the time she put into this. And I'm very grateful for, all of the Lightship crew who showed up here today, my friends who showed up, and for everybody else for that matter as well. These links are some of the references that I used for this presentation. And at this point, I will ask, are there any questions?
Rob, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. So yes, any questions from anyone? I have one I'll start with, and then I'll let others, either put it in the chat or speak up. They can take themselves off of mute and put themselves on camera. But I'm curious, it is such a unique experience you had, and at such a young age. And as you said, it really helped to, shape who you became, and also your love for the water. The story that you told about being at the helm, approaching the Woodrow Wilson Bridge.
Yes.
I mean, it's shocking to me, right? And we just had this bridge incident here.
Right. Yep. Yep.
So I can't even imagine how that felt to you, but I also wonder, and as you said, I mean, you were, it was very disturbing to you too. Were there other harrowing experiences like that? I can't even imagine that one. But I'm just curious as to even storms that might have come up or anything like that. Or you talked about the fog, like to be that young and have those.
Really. I mean,
Okay.
the thing with the steering, when you're 15, 16, 17 years old, you're cocky as hell, and
Yes.
nothing is really a problem. And like I said, while I was steering at that time, I was looking down at the angle indicator. I didn't have a view of what was going on, where we were headed or anything like that. And when the captain called back full, that's when I looked up and realized what the problem was.
Right.
Yeah, my knees were a little shaky. going back up the river because I didn't know whether he would continue to blame me for that or whatever else. But the next time I had the wheel and he let me steer by sight as opposed to by rudder command, told me all I needed to know.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
like I said, it was a pretty heady experience. I mean, it's a 530-ton ship. She doesn't move too sprightly. So, you had to anticipate when to change course and how much to change and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I understand they're taking her to a shipyard this fall, I presume, to paint the bottom. I want to make one side comment here.
And when you have
We
a second,
delivered.
go back to your reference slide that has come up in the chat. So,
Okay.
but go
Yes.
ahead. Yep.
Okay. We delivered a operational ship to Baltimore in 1981. I mean, fully functional, engines, lights, electronic equipment, everything. And now she has become a static display.
Mm.
And you can, and I'm not blaming anybody for that because I understand budgets, I understand priorities, but having delivered her in fully operational condition and then seeing her today, it's a little sad for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would love to see her underway again, but I know that won't happen for lots of reasons. I mean, mainly, I'm sure all that diesel fuel in that tank has just turned to all kinds of sludge. But it was a great experience. It was the kind of thing that teaches one that you can do practically anything that you attempt to do.
Right.
I mean, you want a harrowing experience. Well, one of the ones was I was immediately drawn to the sailing on the widgeons we had. And there was one night that a group of us went out to sail 2 or 3 of them. But again, a storm blew through, and instead of being able to sail back to the lightship docks, we got blown up the channel towards where the fishmonger stalls are there on the Washington Channel. I had to basically go call the lightship and ask someone to come tow me back to the ship because the winds were so strong I could not sail that little boat back to the ship. We didn't have too many frightening experiences. I think we were trained well. We had good people on board, meaning the officers and staff. So we really didn't have any bad experiences. I mean, we had some shenanigans on there, sure.
Right.
There was the time one of the crew went streaking around the deck at night. We locked him out. Mind you, the ship was docked right across the street from the golf course on Haynes Point.
Well,
we would play. Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We have a couple more questions in
Yes.
here, and
Yes.
somebody also wants to tell a story. So let me get to the first question. It's amazing that the ship was made operational again after the Coast Guard retirement. Given the condition you described, how often did she sail while under the National Park Service?
We would have underways on the order of once a month, and they varied. Sometimes we would just go down to Mount Vernon and turn around and come back. Other times we'd go down to Mount Vernon and anchor out for the night. It depended on what the particular program that was scheduled for that weekend would needed.
Did the National Park Service fund all the restoration to sailing status, or was there also other support outside of the National Park Service?
The monetary support came from the Park Service, but as I said in the presentation, Tom McFadden was quite a wheeler dealer, and he was able to talk people into donating things, giving things, helping with things. So a lot of that was offset by that sort of thing.
Well, and I think Chris, you're trying to speak, and I think you had a comment here, and then I'll get to Greg. you said you'd like to comment and tell a funny story, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. My experience on the Lightship was almost 2 years. And I came from having worked as an officer on an oceanographic research vessel, had a lot of experience, and was a teacher. I taught school in South Carolina, but being on a Lightship was very special, and it was a great program. I was very unhappy that the Park Service, the government, decided to take away its support. It was very special. It was a one of a kind of uh, teaching young people, regardless of color, what it's like to be on a vessel and possibly do even some research.
Mhm.
And the story I have is, I don't think they would allow the non-employees work over on the side, but the Lightship, of course, had very large letters, CHESA, yada, yada, yada. And there are weld marks on the side of the ship where anybody with a good ability to see where the weld marks are. And my job was to repaint the Chesapeake, the word Chesapeake. And it was in the summertime, and my shirt was off. I was hot. I was on what's called a bosun chair over the side so that I could, let my, so I could paint and, without really having to hold on. And there was a phone call that came. Some woman across the way from the ship channel wanted to know, what's that naked man doing flying off the ship? That's my
great.
story.
That's great. And I think if I was listening closely enough to Rob, were you the person that spoke up to tell the captain that he had given the wrong? Yes? Yeah. Okay. All
Yes,
right.
Chris was the one that saved my ass that day.
That's what I thought. I thought
Yeah.
I recognized the name. And so Greg K has a question, he says, I know why the ship is no longer going underway. So Greg, can you take yourself off of mute and tell us?
Yeah, hi. My name's Greg Krausick. I'm the current volunteer on the Lightship Chesapeake since 2006. When I took over doing most of the maintenance and repairs, I asked and was told that when the ship came out of the dry dock in 2004, the Park Service had declared that none of the machinery with oil in it was to be run or even touched. So even though all the fuel tanks are currently clean, except for one of the settling tanks down in the engine room, which has been used and rerouted for oil for the heating boiler. The engines, even though I have spare parts, not allowed to touch anything, can't even change the oil, can't do anything. And that's all per the National Park Service direction to the museum.
Okay. Thank you. I had a question about how many other lightships were in operation when LS-116 was retired. Do any of you know that? Rob, do you know that? And
I don't know the exact number, but
just
I
approximately?
think there were at least probably on the order of a dozen or so, because they were
Okay.
also on the Great Lakes as well.
That's right.
There's some on the West Coast, there's some on the East Coast and the Great Lakes. And the architecture of the ships was a little different for each of the locations based on, the ambient conditions in those areas.
And did any of them have additional lives like in education, like, yours did?
I believe that the Chesapeake Lightships programs were unique in its afterlife with the Park Service. I believe all the other ships which currently are still afloat were basically static museum displays.
Wow. Okay.
Cheryl, I have one other quick
Sure.
question.
Go
Not a
ahead.
question, but I just want to recognize Vicki Glenn as having done this remarkable job of going through all of Tom's artifacts and photographs, because she provided some of the crew, including myself, with a CD of many of the photos that you just saw. So I'm forever indebted to her. She was a wonderful member of the crew. And Thompson there says, how often did the ship get underway? Well, it did get underway, maybe 2-3 times a year, quite often taking college students for pretty sophisticated oceanographic type of research, supporting research. So it was also a research platform, and not just for educational for kids in Washington, D.C., but also for the university. So I think that was another reason that I was disappointed to see the funding taken away.
Sure.
Thank you.
And sure. And Vicki, I was going to invite you to, if there's anything you want to add, and thank you so much for helping Rob with this. And Rob, can you take put your camera back on so we can see you?
Let's see. Let me
See if that works.
do this.
I know you're having tech.
That's way too formal.
Yep, stand by.
Go ahead, Vicki.
A couple of things. Working aboard the Lightship was absolutely, I think, for all of us involved, a seminal moment in our growing up, because we all learned so much. We learned so much from each other. The camaraderie of the staff and the kids was just amazing. And one of the things I wanted you all to know, that Tom was very, very adamant that seamanship was practiced and displayed. And once I believe it was the commandant of the Coast Guard came up, and the ship got underway, and he was so impressed with the way the dock crew and the kids on the ship performed. He said he had never seen a Coast Guard crew that adept and that efficient.
Sure.
So, and that was Tom. Tom wanted everybody to do their very best and to do what they could do. I have two quick comments. One is, you saw Mike Champ. It was actually Dr. Mike Champ, who was at American University then, and I sent Rob home with a copy of a letter that Mike sent to UNESCO. I think it was a letter from him or about him, but he was making the point in the mid-70s at international meetings that the Lightship Chesapeake program could be adapted to any program anywhere in the world. Unfortunately, that didn't go anywhere, and part of that is because Tom got transferred up to Catoctin. And I have to tell a story about Rob. He's going to hate me for it. And you know what I'm going to tell. We were out one night on the river, and it was getting dark, and we knew we were not going to get back to dock that night. So we pulled into Dahlgren, and of course, on the radios, on all the craft that were around, we could all hear each other. And so Rob's at the helm of, he actually really is called Chai, if you know him that well.
Okay. I did not know.
Well, that's what I've called him since he was about 15. But we were going into Dahlgren to request permission to just anchor overnight, because we didn't have anything else to do. And I'm sure that Chris was on the tug with Rob, but Rob was doing all the communication with Dahlgren, and you came in, and by the numbers, all the right words, all that stuff. And there was a little back and forth going, and then there was this long silence. And the guy from Dahlgren said, "How old are you?" And Rob said, "I'm 16, sir." So the way he would do it now, I'm sure. But it has been such an honor and a privilege to know him, and Brian McKissick is online, and Bob Hickman, who I hope was online, because they were just such wonderful people to work with and such genuinely interested and caring people.
That's really
So
lovely.
I'm so glad that this program happened, and I really thank you for it.
Well, thank you.
Sorry, Tom. I'm sorry Tom's not here to see it. He would have loved it.
Yeah, and it sounds like he was such a wonderful man. Just listening to the stories and even talking with Rob, before he was preparing this and talking about it, and he said that he was going to, be talking with you and others, to really gather the photos and the stories and all of that. And if I really think about, and what you were just saying about, his age and the way you spoke up, if you really think about how early so many young boys went to sea back in the day, right? Like before, this century and last century. I mean, that 16 was probably a very common age for someone to be guiding the ships and everything. So to have that experience, Rob, it's such a, for you in this time frame, in this, well, it was the last century that you had, but
Sounds funny when you say it that way.
Yes, it was, but it's just remarkable. It's remarkable. So I'm going to ask if there's anybody else that has a question before we close. I've been seeing some really good smiles and nodding of heads. Bill Washington, I'm watching you just enjoy this. So I didn't know if you had any questions or anything. One of our past presidents on here.
No, I'm just enjoying it. I mean, this is, I remember the Chesapeake being here. I've been on the Potomac for over 40 years. And I'm just, the old Wilson Bridge is still the Wilson Bridge, just the new design. And I'm just trying to think of I'm just envisioning Chesapeake trying to ram that bridge. Yeah, no, I've just enjoyed the presentation immensely.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I would say this is absolutely wonderful, and it should be seen again, again, and again. This is a new day, a new administration. Who knows? The Park Service might revisit this. It should. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Always appreciate you.
Yeah, that's a great comment, actually. Yeah. Well, Rob, I know it took you quite a number of months, because you and I talked in November. I think it was the month you were moving, relocating to somewhere.
Yes.
And you were moving in, and I'm trying to like get you to commit to a date, and you're trying to give me an honest answer. And we settled on April. I really wanted you to be our kickoff speaker in January, and you said you just didn't think you could have it done in time.
Yeah, I mean, if I didn't hook up with Vicky until January, and there was just no way I would have gotten all of these photos.
Understood.
Gotten here.
But here's what I'm going to suggest to you and your colleagues here, is this is a great presentation, and it is a great story, to Carol's point. So I do think that there are, our local magazines and other organizations who probably would be very interested in the story. And I will tell you, I also went to a presentation a couple of weeks ago at our local library here about a guy that has recently finished the Great Loop. So those are you already have it put together. You've done, Vicky and you and others have contributed so much to. So to Carol's point, I think, like tell this story again and again, because it's worth telling.
Well, Diane Seltzer of My Boat Life, an online magazine, has
Yes,
asked me to write something for her on this. So that's the first pass. So yeah.
that's
See it,
great.
eat it. Right? You just have to look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. Big
And
picture.
I wanted to point out that Greg has also put a couple things into the chat about asking former crew to go to the website and you know, you can see that before we close the meeting. I just want you to make sure you're seeing the chat. And that he also started a campaign in 2009 to get the Postal Service to issue a stamp with Lightships. So that's a pretty cool one too. So please reach out to each other, continue this conversation. And Rob, from the bottom of my heart, man, it was just so nice to get you to want to talk about this and for you to embrace it so wholeheartedly and invite your colleagues and get all the research done. And thank you, Vicki and others, for your contributions to making this. And I see some hands, Aaron saying hands, you know, thanking you. So very much appreciated. And we look
My
forward,
pleasure.
yeah, we look forward to seeing where this story gets retold.
As we say in Navy parlance, a Bravo Zulu job, a Bravo Zulu job, Rob. It means
Thank you, Mr.
outstanding.
Carusa. Thank
Look
you,
it up.
everybody.
Google it.
Appreciate you.
BZ.
All right. Well, thank you. And please do, you know, continue to look at capca.net. We have our monthly meetings and we would love to have any of you attend anytime. So please don't forget about us. And if you're captains, we want you to join us. So, all right.
Very
Thank
well.
you all.
Good night, all.
Have a wonderful evening.